Social justice means applying the law equally to all people, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. I'm John Gonzalez. I'm here with my law partner, Jack DeRora. We practice law, we seek social justice. On this show, we reveal the conflict between the two.
You know, for a while, it was just us in the office over a cup of coffee talking about the news of the day. With social justice issues dominating our culture, our focus became, how do we as lawyers make a difference?
And now it's not just us. Today we have Nico Perrino, Executive Vice President of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nico is also the creator and host of FIRE's So to Speak, the free speech podcast. Welcome, Nico.
Jack, Gonzo, it's good to be here.
Jack, do you recall when I ran for judge several years ago?
Yes, I do.
I had this brilliant idea on election day that when I was done with my ballot, I would take a picture of it so that I could see my name on the ballot and also show, who I was supporting.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I mentioned it to my wife, Ann, and she said, that's not allowed in Ohio.
Get out of here.
It is a violation of statute, and in many states it is. And I was reading on FIRE's webpage that they actually challenged that. There was a case where a lady did what I did, just taking a picture of her ballot. And it was a very interesting write-up on this case. And essentially, it's a free speech issue. And you wonder, why would they not allow somebody to take a picture of their own ballot?
Better yet, how many people in Ohio know about that law? Probably 3 people, I would guess, maybe 4.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask Nico about that. But the other thing I really got a chuckle out of was, the quintessential free speech analogy is shouting fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
There is a hilarious YouTube video by Will Creeley. He's the legal director, I guess, at FIRE. And he's in a theater, and there's a couple in front of him talking about this. And Nico, it brought me back to my law school days because we're talking about free speech and constitutional law, and of course, I didn't remember that case, but Will talks about it in the YouTube video. But in any event, the professor says, yelling fire in a crowded theater is wrong. And one of my classmates said, "What if it's not crowded?" And that's the point, right? What if it's not crowded? But it made me think about that. But I love that YouTube video, and FIRE does a lot of really interesting things with regard to free speech. And one of them is the advocacy in court, right?
Sure. Yeah, we often get asked, actually, Gonzo, whether FIRE, the acronym, is a deliberate reference to the falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote in his majority opinion in Schenck v. United States. It's not. FIRE is a great, memorable name, and sometimes when you type it into Google, it'll be the first search result, something I'm very proud of as the former communications head here at FIRE. But people also don't realize what that Schenck case was about. It was about a group of socialists in the city of Philadelphia who wanted to hand out anti-draft leaflets in the city of Philadelphia. And they were brought up on the Espionage Act of 1917 charges and jailed. Elizabeth Baer and Charles Schenck were jailed for protesting the draft. Today, that would be unthinkable. And so you learn a lot about the history of free expression in America by looking at the cases of censorship that happened in the early part of the 20th century. A lot of Americans don't even realize that prior to 1931, 140 years after the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, the Supreme Court had never struck down a free speech restriction on First Amendment grounds. Not once.
Wow, that's staggering.
Yeah.
And you think about it today. I was just reading the New York Times, and there's this, there's some free speech issues in the UK right now. And there's this British commentator who said, people in the UK, they don't really appreciate the religious-like commitment that Americans have to free speech. It's very unique. We sort of have free speech exceptionalism here, but that was a hard-fought victory that took about 100 years from 1919, when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote a dissent in a case called Abrams, to about 2019. Jeff Stone, who's a law professor at the University of Chicago, and Lee Bollinger, the former president of Columbia University, actually wrote a book that I'm holding up now called The Free Speech Century, which is about all of the progress. It's a series of essays about all of the progress for free speech that happened over 100 years. But getting back to that Schenck case, I often like to point out the facts of that case so people understand that when they're using that reflexive, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater mantra to justify censorship, that in that case, it was justifying the censorship of people protesting the draft. And they also often leave out the falsely part, which I think is an important component of the test.
Right. And then you got to watch that video if you get a chance on YouTube, because that's what Will kind of said, that it makes a great point, but it does it with such humor and class. I hope he's still with you, because he seems like, a guy that communicates very well too.
He's our legal director, yeah.
Still good. So FIRE, Jack, I don't know if you know this, but they've got hundreds of both where they're actually in litigation, and oftentimes they're just advocating, send a letter on support of somebody whose free speech rights were curtailed, whether it's at a school board meeting or students in college. And I have to be candid with you, Nico. I was looking for some bias. Are you picking and choosing? And I didn't see it. It's basically, look, it doesn't matter what they're saying. They have a right to say it, and we need to understand that that's important. And to me, that's sometimes a hard concept, because let's go to the debate. And this hits a little close to home, because they're apparently Trump and J.D. Vance are lying about what's happening in Springfield.
Thank goodness it's not an important topic.
Yeah, right? my dog Lucy was very concerned, and I had to reassure her that no, she's okay if we go to Springfield.
Right.
But, is lying okay? Is that free speech? Do you have the freedom to tell blatant misrepresentations?
Well, it's a great question. The question I often ask myself as a civil libertarian is, what's the alternative? The alternative is setting up, a government ministry of truth to determine truth from falsehood? I mean, who would you trust with that power to determine what is true and false in a position of authority? I think you would have gotten different answers from the local government in the South in 1960 than you would have in the local government in the North in 1960, right? So it's a hard instinct for most people to understand. They see something that's so wrong-headed. They have such faith in their belief in some sort of particular truth. The idea that I'm going to let this person who's lying, or who I think is lying, speak, that's a very hard thing for a lot of people to grapple. But they need to, as Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger always say, they need to invert the question. They need to inverse the question. What is the alternative, right? And as the Supreme Court has said, time has upset many fighting faiths as well, right? Francis Fukuyama wrote this great essay after the fall of the Berlin Wall called The End of History. The idea being that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, capitalism had won out, socialism had been defeated. We had achieved the end of history when it comes to the evolution of the proper government. I think sometimes people who call for censorship believe we've reached the end of history, that all knowledge has been created, and that we no longer need to debate and discuss different ideas because we already know what's good and true and beautiful. And I do not think that process is ever over. And in fact, if you look at some of the arguments for free speech that John Stuart Mill in 1859, his magnificent treatise on liberty, made to justify free speech, he said, even if something is false, it is important to be confronted with dissenting opinion, because if you do not ever trot your truth out there and confront those who disagree with it, you start to hold your truth as a dead dogma. You believe it without actually knowing why you believe it. And to me, that is such an important principle. I was a student at Indiana University, and there was this evangelical pastor named Douglas Wilson who came to campus. I disagreed with him on a lot. He was, as you might expect from a fundamentalist evangelical, he had some beliefs that I didn't agree with on LGBT rights, conservative social values, and he was shouted down by some of my peers. And he had this great line as he was trying to speak through the audience. He said, "I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right." And what an attitude of a scholar, of a student on campus. You go in there with these strong beliefs that are loosely held. And these students were demonstrating that they had strong beliefs, strongly held. And in fact, those beliefs were so strong that they didn't even need to countenance a dissenting opinion. I think that's fundamentally an anti-intellectual attitude to have. And while I disagreed with Douglas Wilson on almost everything else he said, I saw a nugget of wisdom in there that I think speaks to the broader culture of free speech that I think needs to be inculcated in our society.
Your comment makes me think of a priest who I admire, and I've quoted this fellow some number of times on the show, Richard Rohr. And he says, and he says this in a spiritual context. He says, those who know they don't know.
Yeah. Education, what was it, Socrates? I don't know, some other famous philosopher said, is education is the process of learning our own ignorance. And, free speech is fundamentally an acceptance that at any given moment, with any given argument that you make, you might be ignorant. So it's important to hear the perspectives that you might disagree with. And it's important from, I think, a principled and pragmatic standpoint, right? Pragmatic insofar as you might learn something new. Pragmatic insofar as to the extent laws that allow censorship exist on the books, they can be used on you. One of my mentors and heroes, Ira Glasser, the former head of the ACLU, once said that speech restrictions are like poison gas. Seems like a great weapon when the wind is at your back and the enemy is in your sights. But the wind has a way of shifting. And he gives this beautiful example, or scary example, depending on which way you look at it, of the National Union of Students in the UK in the 1970s. They wanted to pass a hate speech code, and they enlisted the support of the Zionist student organization in the UK. And the Zionist student organization signed on to that hate speech code, was a sponsor and a supporter of it. Well, what happened a few years later? Zionism was deemed to be hate speech, and they were banned from speaking on campus. Right? The wind had shifted, as Ira would say. So from a pragmatic standpoint, you don't want to give those in power the tool to censor, because that tool can then be used on you. But from a principled standpoint, I think it's important that if we believe in a free society where individuals are able to live their lives as they see fit, then we need to be free to be who we are and speak our minds.
You think about social media for a minute, and you think about, Elon Musk stepping in because a lot of speech was censored, that, a private company would consider hate speech. And I had this argument with my brother a number of times where he thinks you should be able to put any type of speech on your social media and not be censored. And I said, I disagree with that. I think there is danger to it. But his argument was kind of like what you're saying, Nico, is one, if you don't agree with it, that is something that you can obviously counter. And second, like you say, you may learn something. And third, oftentimes the speech is so ridiculous that it is censored just because people are like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And it makes the communicator less effective because they're just saying something that's just seems to be generally accepted as ridiculous. So,
well, do you guys recall, what was it, 2017, where that conservative provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos was going to all these campuses, and the campuses were trying to censor him, and it was bringing his book to #1 on Amazon, and then they threw Molotov cocktails at Berkeley, and he spent all night on cable television, just a demonstration of the Streisand effect, that censorship often backfires and creates a greater platform for the speaker that's seeking to be censored. But what did Milo Yiannopoulos in? Well, a couple of months, if not years later, he said some really shocking things about relationships with minors, and nobody wanted to touch him anymore. So free speech allowed himself to be hung by his own petard, right? Sometimes all you need to do is give these people a platform, and they'll kind of self-cancel themselves.
I want to go back to the word you used a few minutes back. You talked about free speech being pragmatic. That is, it fosters this notion of how do I educate myself. But I think that's based on something you didn't say, which is a virtue that's lacking in America, which is the humility to think that there might be another point of view. And we really do get tied, as you say, to an idea without questioning it. And so it becomes dogma that's impervious to change. So it really is a matter of getting to people's better angels, which is quite the process, to get them to be open to free speech and realize that there's more to life than what you have surrounded yourself with.
I don't know about you guys, but when I was in college, the best part about college were those late night conversations in the dorm where you're exploring some of the most difficult questions. And if everyone just agrees with each other, those conversations aren't as fun as when you have real, valuable disagreement. Often I would come away from those conversations questioning my premises. And even if I didn't admit it to my interlocutor on the other side in the moment, like, you know, because I wanted to seem like I was strong in my opinion, like I would go home and stew on it while I got into bed, right? Or while I was in the shower in the morning. And I would either become a better advocate for my previous position or I would change my mind over time. So yeah, I think that's kind of the approach that I think people who are engaged in the world of ideas and who care about getting things right should take.
I think about my days in college, and this was a long time ago, but I can't imagine speaking up or yelling down a speaker in college. It just, I wasn't an activist. I wasn't around activists at my college. I can't imagine it, Jack. Were you involved in that kind of disruptive behavior when somebody said something that you didn't like?
I saw that only once. And like Nico's experience, there was a conservative preacher who came to campus. I went to Notre Dame, Nico.
Oh, go Irish. This past weekend was tough.
It was beyond tough.
My dad played football at Notre Dame. I'm a big Irish fan.
Did he? Yeah. You know, as I'm saying, I don't think those kids remember how to pray. That's the problem. Okay, let's get serious.
Well, as soon as they built the stadium to cover Touchdown Jesus, they'd never been the same since.
Amen, brothers and sisters. But here's what happened. This conservative preacher came, and he was very dogmatic and a very black and white moral. And I was embarrassed for him. Kids shouted him down. First of all, I just thought it was just downright rude. But we're at Notre Dame and you don't want to listen to somebody? Are you kidding me? That was my one experience, Gonzo. Yeah. And I did not take part in the heckling.
Well, can I scare you guys?
Sure.
So FIRE conducts the largest survey of college students in the United States. We just released our last one, our annual one, 59,000 college students. So this is a pretty representative survey, right? We asked students whether it's acceptable to some degree to block other students from attending a campus speech if they're offended by the speaker. 52% of students reported that it's acceptable to block a speaker on campus to some degree. That's up from 45% the year before and 37% 2 years prior. Even more concerning, 32% of students reported that using violence to stop a campus speech, violence, is acceptable to some degree. That's up from 27% last year and 20% 2 years ago. So students have this fundamentally illiberal attitude. And I don't know where it's coming from. It's probably from education. It's that we're not inculcating the values of what it means to live in a pluralistic society. But they think if a speaker offends them, that it can sometimes be okay to block other students from confronting that speaker or attending the speech or even using violence to do so. And the violence thing is the thing that really concerns me. Because often you're seeing now arguments that are conflating speech and violence. And if you view speech as violence, I think the whole ballgame goes out. As Sigmund Freud once said, civilization was started the day man first cast a word instead of a stone. And now if we see words as stones, that is a big problem. So I'm very concerned about the direction that things are heading on college campuses with regard to illiberal student attitudes.
In the book that your partner wrote, The Canceling of the American Mind, there was a reference to that. I think he was a Yale professor, Christakis. Am I saying that right?
Nicholas Christakis, yes, a professor at Yale.
This is a YouTube you got to watch. So this gentleman is being confronted by, I don't know, pretty good sized group of students, 50, maybe 100 for something.
Not just confronted, surrounded.
Surrounded.
Circled,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah. For something his wife wrote regarding how students, she was criticizing the university for, in essence, sending out a mandate as to how students should or should not dress for Halloween. What was so striking was that the students, one of them really got in Christakis's face. Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of demanding that Christakis accept them, understand them, et cetera, et cetera. And that view of the students, they were all hostile, was that you have to accept me right now, you have to understand me, as opposed to how do we understand each other? What do I need to know about you so that you can better know me? And it's also a position that is inconsistent with, I think, Buddhism or Stoicism or the New Testament, where, you know, you accept the things that you don't like and you move on. You don't try to force your view on other people. And these students are really trying to force their view on Christakis, as opposed to being in an academic setting and saying, how do we talk about this? It was really confrontational. Yes. And I thought, and he did a brilliant job of keeping his cool. Right?
Yeah, superhuman cool. It's the idea that what unites us is greater than what divides us. I'd love to see more of that in our society. But to Erica Christakis' letter, so Nicholas Christakis is married to Erica Christakis, and they were the headmasters at Silliman Hall, which is essentially a dorm room, an academic dorm room, or a dorm facility at Yale. And Erica wrote a letter that was responsive to a letter that was sent out by the Yale administration that warned students about certain Halloween costumes that might offend. And Erica is a specialist in childhood and youth development. And she wrote a letter that said, is this really the right thing for the college administration to do, to be telling students on a holiday that's all about transgression what they should or shouldn't be wearing for their Halloween costumes? And for that, there were calls for her to be fired, to step down as the house master. They confronted Nicholas as if Erica's position was also Nicholas. They surrounded him in the courtyard of Silliman Hall and essentially demanded a sort of in loco parentis that in 1964, the Berkeley free speech movement tried to throw off and was largely successful in doing it. Be like, we don't want the adults here at the college to determine for us what we can say or what we can't say, or when we can leave our dorm or when we can't leave our dorm, or who we can date and who we can't date. Like, we want that freedom. This is going back to like the 1980s, right? With Dee Snider saying, we're not going to take it. Where is the sort of young person transgressor that says like, yeah, a letter from the administration telling me what Halloween costumes I want to wear? Like, that's something that they're now trying to do. They're trying to enlist power to, I don't know, protect their sensibilities. It's completely antithetical to the movement that we saw 50 years ago to throw that off. And so it's mind-boggling in a certain respect.
And on a very simple level, I just think it's offensive for 19 and 21-year-olds to be confronting this man who's a gentleman and cool, calm, and collected, and to be basically insulting him as if they're so smart. It was just stunning.
They're also... I'm sorry, Nico. They're also confronting him over something that was his wife's doing. It
right.
Kind of reminds me of the more recent thing with, I go back to sports a lot, Nico, but Brittany Mahomes, right? She liked a Trump post. She just liked it.
Okay.
And of course, everybody was up in arms over that don't like Trump. And so her husband, the Chiefs quarterback, had to answer for that, for what his wife did on some social media. But his answer was wonderful. I don't know if you read it in the paper.
I didn't see it.
He basically said, look, I'm not going to use my platform to advocate for any person, but I will use it to advocate for registering to vote, doing your homework, and voting for who is the best person for you. I thought, what a wonderful response.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this reluctance to talk across lines of difference. And I think it goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier about how there's this increasing tendency in society to assume that someone's worst possible motive is their only possible motive, or to believe that what divides us is greater than than what unites us. And I'm a big fan of the old school civil libertarians who created that free speech century I was talking about. The people like Ira Glasser led the ACLU for 23 years. The people like Aryeh Neier, who led the ACLU before him. Folks like Nadine Strawson, who's a senior fellow at FIRE. These are names that people don't know, but they really lived out the ideal of free expression. And part of that ideal is a willingness and frankly, an eagerness to talk across lines of difference. I was struck, I believe it was later 2010s, maybe even 2020, 2021, when the New Yorker magazine wanted to host a Battle of Ideas festival. And they invited Steve Bannon to come and sit on the panel about it. And there were efforts to get him removed from the panel. This is someone who at the time was a senior advisor to Trump, had a lot of say over the ideas that would be enacted as policy in the United States. If you're having a battle of ideas, why not battle it out with the guy who has a lot of ideas and ideas that are going to perhaps affect you quite considerably? But they succumbed to the cancellation attempt. And Malcolm Gladwell, the New York Times bestselling author, said, what is this, a battle of ideas or a dinner party? Like, what are we doing here? What is the purpose? Do we just want to talk amongst ourselves in this echo chamber and have no larger impact on society? Or do we want to start change minds, poke holes in other people's arguments? And these old school civil libertarians, Ira Glasser, for example, became best friends with William F. Buckley Jr. And there were things they could agree on about, like drug legalization, for example. And there were things they couldn't agree on. And when they couldn't agree, they would go on Firing Line, the old PBS show, and have it out. When they could agree, they would also go on Firing Line, but be on the same side of the debate, right? These cross-partisan friendships, like between Justice Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, are harder to have, I think, today, just because everyone who disagrees with us, we almost have like this moral pollution sense of friends and enemies, is just that, an enemy. But I think Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said, "Do I not destroy my enemy when I make him my friend?" People don't take that approach anymore.
When we think about your organization, FIRE, is your advocacy for free speech, is it limited to where there's some type of government involvement? My recollection of the constitutional teachings back in law school was it's the government that can't violate free speech, but certainly, I can violate Jack's free speech if it's just he and I in our living room. Mm-hmm. But I mean, as far as your organization, do you have to find some type of government involvement before you get, involved in these cases?
You guys might know the jurist Learned Hand. He was a famous judge on the Second Circuit back in the middle part of the century. And he gave this famous speech called The Spirit of Liberty in Central Park in 1944. Now, let's remember what's happening in 1944. We're invading Europe. Fascism is on the rise. Communism is on the rise. And he says, I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes, he says. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, there's no constitution, no law, no court that can even do much to help it. And I think that's right. I think you need much more than a belief in First Amendment law. I think you need a belief in a culture of free expression. He goes on to later say, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right.
Ooh.
What does the law have? I mean, that's a principle that you can take beyond the law. The spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. It goes back to what we were talking about. Strong opinions loosely held. I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. Right? And so if you bring that spirit to our broader conversations, our willingness to talk across lines of difference, to play with ideas, to be a devil's advocate, to assume that someone's worst possible motive is not their only possible motive, I think you get a culture that is fundamentally more liberal, small L liberal, and a culture that is fundamentally smarter because we're not afraid of disagreement. We're not afraid of playing with ideas. So why do I bring this up? The law is important, and FIRE generally only gets involved on the legal side when the government is censoring. And that is very important work. Let's not underestimate that. That's the most important place where censorship materializes. But we do argue also for this broader culture of free expression. So we are opponents of so-called cancel culture, where you try and win arguments by not winning arguments, but by figuring out some way to shut down the speaker or get them fired from their job or deplatformed from something that they were previously platformed on. There are tensions, and culture is always more ambiguous than the law is going to be. There are going to always be hard cases. But the way I break it down is to say our instinct in response to speech that we dislike isn't and shouldn't be to figure out some way to shut that person down or to get them fired from their job, but rather to poke holes in their argument, tune them out if that's your thing, or engage in a dialogue and try and convince them as to why your side is right and their side is wrong. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we are behind the learned hand spirit of liberty argument that the spirit of liberty is not just the laws and the Constitution, but it's this broader cultural thing that can be found in our idioms, right? The things that we tell ourselves. Sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never harm me. To each their own. It's a free country. You don't hear those idioms as much anymore, as my colleague Greg Lukianoff likes to say. What does that say about our culture?
Yeah, and that's, I think, the whole challenge. How do you inculcate that into our I can't even say it, into our culture? Because from what I hear at a distance, my kids are no longer in school. Civics has played a lesser role in education, and we're not fostering those concepts with high school students, or at least I don't think we are.
Well, I think when you see statistics like 40 some odd percent 32% of college students support using violence to shut down speakers on campus to some degree, then yeah, they're clearly arriving on campus with a misconception as to what it means to live in a pluralistic democracy. So it's been a while since I've been in high school. FIRE's work mostly focuses on college campuses and beyond. We don't do as much work. We don't do curricular development, for example, in high school. But yeah, something clearly is going wrong where students aren't arriving on campus with an understanding of what life should be like in a pluralistic democracy and the values that undergird it.
When we think about the broader culture of free expression, it brings to mind the economic forces that censor free speech. And you just think again of a very recent example. Taylor Swift came out and said, I'm voting for Kamala Harris. And the response on the conservative side was, well, that's going to hurt her economically because all of these MAGA people are done with buying her product. And, it made me pause as to who else might want to come out and say, hey, this is my belief, but selling their product, marketing themselves is more important because, half the country will dislike you no matter who you choose for president right now.
We've seen that. I assume you know the name Nico Bobby Starbuck.
The name sounds familiar. I wouldn't know the story that you're alluding to, though. Well,
he's a conservative and a provocateur, or as I've heard one person refer to those types of people in general, he's a conflict entrepreneur. But he has approached companies and somehow driven them. Ford was the most recent to divest themselves of their DEI programs. Mm-hmm. And the thrust behind that strategy was economics. And it's, I guess, not directly relevant to the mission of FIRE, but it certainly speaks.
No, it is.
Well, okay, all the finer. I was just mentioning it because of what Gonzo was saying about the economics of free speech. And yes. I just thought, wow, Ford is, I'm pretty certain it was Ford. It's also been a problem with Lowe's. They dropped these programs because he brings this wave of economic fright to them.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Well, I think the challenge that a lot of organizations and institutions, including institutions of higher education, have is that they don't understand what their raison d'etre is, what their core mission or principle is. So for some companies, it might be producing shareholder value, right? And so if there is that economic hit, then that's a problem, right? And so we adjust accordingly. But I think one of the reasons that these colleges and universities have gotten in trouble and been so censorial in the past couple of years is because they don't have a fundamental understanding of what their core mission is. I like, for example, the University of Chicago's core mission as articulated in its Calvin report, which is that it's the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge. And everything the university does, every decision it makes, every policy it puts in place flows up to that mission. And Claudine Gay, in the wake of October 7th, wrote and rewrote 7 different statements because she was just acting like a weather vane, responding to whatever constituency didn't like the previous statement. But if you are like the University of Chicago and you say our mission is the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge, and as the University of Chicago says, in order to preserve that mission, we don't issue statements on social and political issues. We are the host and sponsors of the debates. We are not the debaters ourselves. Then you don't ever have to write a statement like that. You never have to get yourself into that position. Why would we take a statement on this? We're the host and sponsors of the debate, right? And so, but that also requires a commitment to stand by that mission when it's tested. It requires a commitment to that principle. And as Jon Stewart, the comedian, not the philosopher, said, that, if you don't stand by principles when they're tested, they're not principles, they're hobbies. So are we going to be free speech hobbyists? Or are we going to be principled on the values that we hold near and dear? And it can be hard. In the wake of October 7th, FIRE was going out there and defending pro-Palestinian activists who had their free speech rights violated. We lost donors over it. Mm-hmm. But we'll drive this thing into the wall if that's what it requires to be principled. After Claudine Gay and Liz McGill and the president of MIT testified in response to that question about whether calls for genocide are prohibited by their campus's policies, and they said context matters, I went on Jake Tapper on CNN and said, well, actually, they were right. Context does matter. Anytime you're talking about exceptions to free speech, context matters, right? They're talking about it in the context of chants like From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free, or Intifada. But right now, the narrative on college campuses is that Israel's invasion of Gaza is a genocide. So are your policies going to say that supporting Israel's war is a call for genocide of the Palestinian people? How are these amorphous anti-genocide policies going to be wielded against activists or advocates on either side of that issue? You need to think long term, and that's what most people don't have, is that civil libertarian instinct. Norman Siegel, the former executive director of the NYCLU, once said, if I ever got a tattoo on my chest, it would be neutral principles. That's what it's all about, the fair application of neutral principles. He says, sometimes I'm accused by people who come up to me and say, Norman Siegel, you're the lawyer for the Klan. He says, no, I'm not the lawyer for the Klan. I'm the lawyer for the First Amendment, and the First Amendment is for everyone, including the Klansmen. Mm-hmm. But that's not an intuitive principle that many people have. That's not an intuitive perspective that people have. And so you get a lot of flack, including economic backlash, when you drive that bus into the wall and stand on principle. But as the ACLU learned, and I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, in their Skokie case, when they defended the rights of neo-Nazis to rally in a town of 6,000 Holocaust survivors, it can hurt you in the short term. But what do we look back on that case today? It is the paradigmatic example of what it means to stand on principle in defense of free speech. So while passions and factions might be producing economic pressure on you now, if you believe in your cause and you believe, like Martin Luther King, that the cause of justice is long, but it bends towards justice, then know what you believe. The NAACP was advocating for school desegregation in the 1930s when nobody else believed that that was something that could or should happen. Well, what do you get in 1954? You get Brown v. Board of Education. So I'm willing to stand by principle and play the long game. But unfortunately, we live in an age of the politics of expediency and not principle, and too many people are erring on the side of expediency. Rant over. Sorry.
No, that's wonderful. I when I was reading your the bio, a little bit about you, I came across that you were a consultant on The Coddling of the American Mind, which is a book that I really liked. I don't know how I came across it, but and I don't know what that means to be a consultant on it, but it struck me as interesting the way that universities, want to create this safe environment so that people are not offended. And, I used to tell my kids that the reason they're going to public schools is for the diversity of what you get in a public school. And you're going to meet all types of people. Some of them you're not going to like. Some of them are going to offend you and not like you. And guess what? You need to deal with them all so you're a productive adult. But what did you do as a consultant for that book? That's interesting.
Well, it was first an article. Cover story for The Atlantic in 2015, the second most read cover story in Atlantic history at the time. And then it became a book in 2018. And I provided some notes on the book because it was written by my colleague and someone we work with often, Jonathan Haidt. But I was a consultant on the film that was based on the book that came out earlier this year. So I'm a filmmaker. I had my own documentary that came out in 2020 called Mighty Ira about the life and career of former ACLU executive director Ira Glasser. And I consulted and helped with the distribution and the story behind the documentary for The Coddling of the American Mind.
That's wonderful. Nico, we appreciate your time and your thoughts, and I love how you bring quotes to make your point. Again, I wish I had his voice, and I wish I had his command of, of these wonderful quotes from scholars across the centuries. But thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, I'm happy to be here. And quotes are the things you fall back on, because there are a lot of very smart people out there, smarter than I am, who have said a lot of the things that I could less eloquently state. So might as well just go back to them. Jack, Gonzo, is really, really a pleasure to be here with you.
And by the way, nothing you said could be characterized as a rant. I was hanging on every word. But I will do you the favor of offering you one quote. George Will, he was talking about students, and he said, "Students don't want free speech. They want freedom from speech."
Yep. That's actually the title of one of my colleagues, Greg Lukianoff's books. In 2014, he wrote a book called Freedom from Speech.
Yeah.
He's the same guy who wrote the Canceling the American Mind and co-authored the aforementioned Coddling of the American Mind. So, he has this way of coming up with these good pithy phrases, and I love George Will. He often says very nice things about fire, and I'll always take those compliments when we can get them, because when you're doing free speech work, often you're doing the work of the unpopular, and you get a lot of criticism. So when you can get the praise, you'll take it.
Absolutely. Well, good for you. Hey, our thanks to you again, Nico, and our thanks to WOSU and our sound engineer, Dalton Jones. If you like what you've heard today, tell a friend. We want this to be more than just us. We want it to be all of us. We'll be back in another week or so with another social justice issue. Until then, so long.